It's my pleasure to open the panel discussion. I look at Michael Feigler, who is going to introduce the panelists. To my left, we are very pleased to have a distinguished panelist, Peter Kalash, and he will be introduced also by Michael. And further to my left is Wojciech Kaleski.
Roughly.
Sorry. Kotecki. But the Wojciech is okay. Wojciech Kotecki. And this is what we're hoping to do. We are hoping that each of the panelists, after the introduction, will present the view of this moment of transition in which we are right now for capitalism, if you want to think of it that way, and to get an illustration and to focus and to be practical about what we are talking about. We think of the process for the COP21 that is going to happen in Paris in December of this year, but also what happens after that. So it's not restricted to COP21, right? I have instructions. But at the same time, the COP21 is very important because it has two elements that are critical to this transition of capitalism. One of them is the question of inequity or equity, the connection between the rich and the poor nations, which is always the point where the COP annual meetings for negotiations breaks down. You agree, right? So that gives you the issue of inequality at the global scale head on. And the second one is the use of the world resources that are under such tremendous stress, connected with North-South international trade, and of course the limits and the global environmental limits, the crisis that we have, of which the climate crisis is perhaps the most immediate right now, but I hesitate to say this, but water is under tremendous stress and so is biodiversity. However, because we have COP21, I'm going to insist that people, when they speak in very concrete terms about the recommendations for COP21 and beyond, thinking of it, the use of the world resources, the extraction and use of the world resources and trade of the world resources, and the inequality north-south.
May I for a second?
Yes.
Before we get any further, let me just briefly introduce who are we talking to today, and then I would like Ms. Chichelnyski to actually introduce what is COP21, because I don't believe everybody knows in the room, and I would like you to introduce it in detail. Anyways, the introduction was done by Ms. Gracia Chichelnyski, who was named CEO of 2015 for the United States, and her company, Global Thermostat, was named one of the 10 largest growing companies, fastest growing companies in the United States when it comes to energy. She's also been presiding the panel who was awarded the Nobel Prize for Economy, has been lecturing on many profound universities such as Harvard, Columbia. Now she's at Stanford, and she's been kind enough to accept our invitation for this year's Prague Summer School. To her left is Petr Kalash, who is a former Minister for the Environment. Now he acts as a chief advisor to the Minister of Environment. He spent 11 years with the World Bank, and he's been advisor to 3 past premiers of the Czech Republic. And last but not least, we have Wojciech Kotecki, who works for Geopolis, which is a Prague-based think tank, and used to be campaign director for Friends of the Earth, NGO of the Czech Republic. So that's as far as the introduction goes. And now, if you would allow, please, could you elaborate what is COP21? What's going on in Paris? What are the efforts you are talking about?
Sure. The COP21 COP means Convention of the Parties. See, Convention of the Parties, COP. It's 21 because there were 21 of those. They are annual meetings by which the United Nations is trying to resolve the problem of climate change. And the parties are the parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. One of the first efforts of the UNFCCC was in the year 97, the creation of the Kyoto Protocol. And I'm very familiar to that because I designed and I wrote into the Kyoto Protocol the carbon market, which is now very widely accepted, but is really a critical point, but not the only point of the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol main point is to limit emissions, country by country. So that the COP21 has the following characteristics, which is why it's so important. These conventions occur every year. They basically started in the year 94. And these conventions are supposed to come up with a resolution. And now, this December, we have the final date for the emission limits in the Kyoto Protocol. And the ambition, which is called enlarged ambition, is to make those global. Because until now, we only have limits on the rich OECD nations, make them global, including developing nations. And that's extremely difficult, and so far there is no sign that it's going to happen. But the COP21 is probably the most important global negotiation in decades. And one of the issues is that it is now recognized that limiting emissions is not enough. That unless we actually remove what's already there in the atmosphere in terms of CO2, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is an association of thousands of scientists that advises the UN from all over the world, all the nations, believes that we won't be able to avert catastrophic climate change unless we actually remove the CO2 which is already in the atmosphere. So we had to do much more than reduce emissions. We had to take what was already emitted before. We had to end up with technologies that end up with less carbon in the atmosphere than we start. They are called carbon negative technologies. And the IPCC fifth assessment report, of which there were 5, that was published in 2013 and then finally distributed mostly in 2014, was more is needed now than ever. We need carbon negative technologies to remove the CO2 already there, or in approximately 15 years, 15, 20 years, we are faced with a point of no return in terms of the creation of what's actually a catastrophic risk for humankind, for human civilization. Last week, the Pope, the new Pope, Pope Francis, who happens to be Argentinian born, like I am, so he came up with an encyclic, which is a very important document that popes produce every few decades. By the way, I'm Jewish, so just keep in mind that I don't have the inside track on that. But anyway, Pope Francis is, in his encyclical, said that the scientists have no doubt of the impact of human action on the climate, and there is also no doubt that the continuation of the current patterns will lead to an irreversible point, a point of no return, in which the future of the human species is at stake. Now, the Pope, of course, is not a scientist, but he happens to be speaking out of what scientists are saying. In the context of all this, we have the Kyoto Protocol, which is the first ever agreement made in 1997, became international law in 2005. You need to do something to remove those limits and increase ambition so they encompass all nations. The carbon market, which is now supported by the largest oil and gas companies like Total, British Petroleum, Shell, they are all supporting and endorsing and recommending to the UN to increase the action of the carbon market. So the whole situation is heating up, and the risks are now considered to be potentially catastrophic in 15 years, 15, 20 years, and irreversible. So we had to do something, and the IPCC comes up and says, and we need carbon negative technologies. And we are going to end up, it looks like, with the usual situation where the industrial and the developing nations cannot see eye to eye, so we have to do something about the relationship between industrial and developing nations. So what you have in the COP21, in a nutshell, is the problem of humankind, the problem of what's happening with capitalism, the inequality between the rich and the poor, our insane use of the world resources and overuse of the world resources since the Industrial Revolution. And this includes the three resources on which our survival as a species depends. We need food, without which we die in a few weeks, biodiversity. We need water, without which we die in a few days. That's the bodies of water that are 70% of the planet. And we need air, without which we die in a few minutes. And that's the atmosphere of the planet. Those three issues are intimately connected with the issue of the climate negotiation, particularly the one of the atmosphere, but as it turns out also the biodiversity and the issue of water. But those three issues are the issues that are pressed upon us by the extraordinarily successful development of capitalism, not just since the Industrial Revolution, but particularly since World War II, when we created the Bretton Woods institutions, which are the first global financial institutions created by human beings that led with an incredibly successful period of globalization. And that period of globalization, on the other side, led to an extraordinarily dangerous situation for human beings that were altering the planet's atmosphere, the bodies of water, and the complex web of species that make life on Earth. So this is all the topic of our organization in economic terms, and make no mistake, these issues that we're talking about, distribution, the use and extraction of the world resources, and the trade, they're economics. So we're talking about what is the world economy doing about that. The question of inequality is caused by economics. The question of overuse of the world resources is caused by economics. That's the cause. It has to be the solution. So we need to talk about the evolution of economics. And of course, the most successful economic theory and economic structure that we have is capitalism. Incredibly successful. Too successful. And it has led to this, successfully led to this incredible booming inequality between the rich and the poor that is beyond the pale to even think about how it has tripled since 1945. The difference between wealth and the rich and the poor nations. And this extraordinary, bizarre, extravagant use of the world resources that is denuding the oceans, which are the sources of life, and threatening all biodiversity on the planet in what is now known to be the sixth largest incident of biodiversity destruction in the planet that is 4 billion years old. And this time, this sixth largest extinction caused by us, caused by economics. So this is essentially this evolution that we're looking at, whatever happened since World War II and why, the Bretton Woods institutions, what's going to happen with capitalism, and that's the topic. And COP21 has the advantage of focusing our brains in something that is going to happen 6 months from now that could be definitive for the survival of the human species. And in which we may be able to find solutions, because we are all focusing trying to have a global accord. So that's why I thought that COP21, and those are the topics that are pretty wide, actually.
Thank you very much. It was a really broad topic, and you brought it back to COP21. Mr. Kalash, could you possibly comment on what Mr. Chilnitsky just said?
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation of being with you today. Let me open the perspective in a slightly broader sense. The climate and the resolution of climate problems is a prerequisite for keeping sustainability on the planet. Planet, as we know, is facing a number of megatrends, negative megatrends, which in different speed and different impacts could in medium, large or long term endanger the survival of the planet. Megatrends, we can mention not only the climate change, it's the ozone layer, which we partly resolved. It's also a question of food, of a growing population up to 9-10 billions would need more space, would need more food. Water is a very critical element, biodiversity. Warming of the world oceans changes the capturing capacity for CO2. So there is a number of endangering processes which we do not know how they would act in together, and where the tipping point where the planet and the resilience of planet would sustain these negative trends and would keep into uncontrolled way. So concentrating on climate is one of the closest, probably not the easiest, but the concrete way how to diminish one of the dangers which are on our horizon in the next, let's say, 50, 100 years. Coming to climate, to add something to Graciela, there is a scientific recognition, and I think that's the starting point, that we should not allow the warming of the atmosphere above 2 degrees of centigrade, 2 degrees of centigrade, which represent a certain density of CO2 in the atmosphere. The density of atmosphere increases the temperature. And the calculation of scientists is that we should not, in a cumulative way from the past into the future, excess remaining balance of CO2 emissions of 1,000 gigatons a year. So we have a clear limit how the saturation of CO2 in the atmosphere is allowed. And that's the challenge of the accord in Paris and our behavior in Paris and afterwards, whether we manage to reduce these emissions to the level that the 2 degrees, which is considered by scientists as a probable behavior, safe behavior of the planet, could be reached. There are different scenarios from now as business as usual, and if we would not change our behavior, so expectations are that the temperature would grow in next 50, 100 years by 4 or 5 degrees, which arise or just enters this uncontrolled way of planetary behavior. So there are also on the other side expectation that we should reduce the current emissions by 85 in the course of time, even by more percentage, to stabilize the behavior of the planet in this sense. And there is a catalog of measures which would allow the reduction, gradual reduction, which starts, as most of them are connected with energy. Energy is probably one of the area with providing answer or providing the problems. Energy should be a part of the solution and not the part of the problem. So the behavior about energy. And the answer lies in different technological ways. The international renowned agencies like International Energy Agency determined a catalog of 5-6 measures how to reduce successfully the future emissions in the energy field, like much more advanced energy efficiency, how to better produce, how to better use the energy. On the technological side, on the energy side, is a growing role of renewable energies, which are supposed not to create any additional emissions, CO2. Another way is technological, much more than advanced technologies, nuclear, advanced technologies in even coal-fired. So this catalog of measures is known. The challenge is to mobilize the political and the commercial political movement, political support, and the commercial interest to follow this path for the future. And it's expected that by 2050, we should reduce the emissions on the planet by 85%. A challenge which is tremendous, and in history it never happened such a challenge. Our challenges were more in a national scale, in the regional scale. And the question is whether the mankind could mobilize the effort towards the emission reduction. We have good and we have bad examples. If we concentrate on good examples, so you will remember the concern of ozone layers. Ozone layers was discovered by scientists as a phenomena which impacts practically the whole planet. There were no winners and no losers. Everybody would lose. And amazingly, this joint feeling of endangering every individual created political will, and in few years the ozone layer protocol was signed and implemented. So there is example in our history. We are probably not smart and intelligent enough to recognize that climate change would in a way represent the same challenge, same danger, same concern. And that's the question of recognition. And the question is whether we should accept the development until there is no way out, and so the fear will create our movement, or whether we could predict, we could prevent and act in the most advanced and I think also economically a more feasible way. There are some studies by world economists, Mr. Stiglitz and Lord Stern and the others, are clearly demonstrating that there is a way how to reduce the emissions, that there is a way to do it in an economic way, that it's possible to do it without any extra large impact on our economic performance. We are talking about 0.5%, 1%, to dedicate our effort to changes which are on the horizon, which would help to diminish the emissions. One of the challenging questions in this country, in several countries, is how this effort to address climate change would affect business. And the very simple and I think short bypassing the major problem is the conclusion that the climate change is against the interests of the climate, that would put some additional burden on business, which is against the interest of business making profit. Very recent analysis by a special commission, which was led by former Mexican President Calderon and some other persons, proved that there is a way for better economy, including better climate. And the question and the solution seems to be very simple, though politically challenging. All investment in infrastructure from now on, and there is an estimate that about 30 trillion US dollars to be spent in investment in next 30 years on the planet, should from now on have this climate component. So should be focused on energy effective way of low energy efficiency, effectiveness, or low energy consumption, of lower emitting profile. And this change of this kind of profile of new investment creates, of course, a very strong opportunity and incentive for business. So the question is, or maybe the purpose is, how to combine the global challenge of climate change with the global commercial interest of our planet. And that's one of the mechanisms which we try through the negotiations, through at all levels, international, national, how to combine these two elements. And I think Paris will struggle with this, let's say, integration of these interests of different parties. Compared to ozone layer, they are losers and they are winners. And it's a major difference in climate change. Some of the countries are speculate on increased temperature which would favor the agriculture. Some of the northern areas, maybe part of Russia, part of Canada. They are losers like Saudi Arabia with oil resources. And there are a number of interests around the negotiating table, with Graciela mentioned during the process of the COP. The magic and the most difficult is how to unify these different opinion, interests, and fear, concerns, and of course expectations in some kind of compromise, which in Paris is expected to result. So Paris is an opportunity, is a challenge, and it's a hope that this growing incompatibility of our planet with this climate change would find some slowdown, which is the first part, that the increase in emissions will not follow the trend, but it would be just slower, and to keep it after 2020, maybe later down, dramatically down to 2050. That's about the Paris conference, Paris Accord. But it's not only the expected results. It's very difficult. But we need to mobilize the broad participation. There is a dividing line between industrialized countries and the developing countries. The major principle of COP agreed across the line that the mankind, the planet, has a shared responsibility, but differentiated responsibility for causing this situation. And that's why the trend and pressure from developing countries is on industrialized countries to pay for all these measures which are requested in these countries. And that's a very important dividing line, because in the meantime, the emissions in developing countries exceeded the profile of industrialized countries. So there is a really question about now the future, because the future trends of emission will clearly be in China, in India, in these new emerging economies, while the countries like United States, Europe, and others are stabilizing or even decreasing their emissions. So some of these arguments and some of these factors would just reflect how difficult the process in Paris will be, and we will discuss more details, let's say, after the next round.
Sure. Mr. Kotecki, do you think that the challenge is surpassable, that there is a space for compromise and that the compromise will and can be reached?
Yep, thank you, and thank you for the invitation. Well, the simple answer would be yes, even though one does not necessarily would think that this is a logical conclusion given the nature of the process. That, as Professor Cieśliński already mentioned, this is the 21st conference in this process, and the process has been long, increasingly torturing, increasingly complex, and increasingly technical. And I think that less and less people actually believe that we as a global international community are able to reach a reasonable argument and a reasonable agreement. I think that there are two possible ways of approaching that. We could look at it from a narrow and technical perspective of the international negotiations, or we could look at the wider perspective. From a narrow point of view, there will be two major issues in Paris. One is obviously commitments. How much, which country will reduce its own carbon emissions, and it's probably crucial that just today China announced its own voluntary carbon reduction commitment, which is a major breakthrough, a result of several years of behind-the-scenes negotiations run primarily by the Chinese government and Obama administration, something what would be basically unthinkable several years ago. And the key question is whether we will be able to get other southern countries on the board, India, Brazil, South Africa, and so on, by the end of the year.
Do you think it's rather political or business question?
Both, and political in terms of international politics, which is a complex set of different issues. And one of the key problems, which I will come back to later, is that we need to view these negotiations from a wider perspective, and we should not focus just on the climate aspect of the whole thing. So commitments is one thing. The other major item on the agenda will obviously be money. We know that we can't expect, especially countries like India, to make their share, to produce their share by themselves, because their emissions, their per capita emissions are very low. They are poor countries and they will need some contribution from the rich world in order to transform them to clean technology. And one specific part of this money debate will or should be fossil fuel subsidies. This is something world leaders have been debating within G20 for several years already. Countries of the world sort of absurdly spend something like $500 billion of fossil fuel subsidies every year. We spend something like almost $500 billion on burning coal, oil and natural gas across the world in this sort of subsidies, and we already know that just slashing fossil fuel subsidies would make sure that the emissions will decrease enough in order to meet 1/6 of the commitment we need in order to reach the 2 degrees level, which Petr Kalash already mentioned. So that it is a major part of the deal. Some Southeast Asian countries like Indonesia spend more than 3% of their GDP on fossil fuel subsidies. The Czech Republic spends something like, the government takes and spends, redistributes something like 30% of GDP in the Czech Republic. So that imagine that 1/10 of all government expenditure in the Czech Republic would be just on oil subsidies. It's an incredible figure, especially for poor countries like Indonesia or Pakistan. And the third point, I think that we need an exit strategy for Paris Summit. And this is something we learned in Copenhagen in a similar conference 6 years ago, when everybody expected that we will get an agreement. After weeks of torturous negotiations, there was no reasonable agreement. There was something called Copenhagen Accord, which is good proclamation. It does some things. For example, it said explicitly that 2 degrees is an international goal for the international community, which is a major step forward. But there was no clear binding agreement on emissions reduction. And then, after weeks of everybody expecting we will get an agreement in Copenhagen, there was no real deal. The sense of failure was so widespread that it almost derailed the global negotiations. And I think that we need to make sure that this does not happen in Paris. And there is a reasonable chance that there will be no substantial agreement in Paris, that we will need to continue negotiating afterwards, and we need some exit strategy. And in this context, I believe that a wider perspective is particularly important. We've had these attempts of conversation about the way we are going to proceed with capitalism, the title of today's debate, since at least the financial crisis in 2007. And this climate process might be a good opportunity to turn from rather philosophical debates into something practical. And the way of doing that would be probably more explicit linking of the climate negotiations with the other key global challenges we face in the current world. We already do have some tradition of linking climate negotiations with development issues and the reduction of poverty. This has been always sort of part of the climate debate, and we might link climate issues or climate negotiations with other global issues in a similar and probably more explicit way. An obvious candidate, of course, is energy. There's an obvious link between climate and energy. We've had some discussion about our reliance on high energy consumption, fossil fuels, even a part of the climate context of the problem, and we might start thinking about, for example, some sort of international deal that would pool the resources we spend in different countries on energy innovation. Shouldn't we have some sort of, well, there have been long debates about kind of a new Manhattan project. Project Manhattan was this US project when America developed the nuclear bomb during the World War II with massive investment of resources, massive concentration of scientists, of the best brains, and of money. And there's been some kinds of talks about an energy Manhattan project over the last several years in different countries, in Europe, in the US. There are sort of this kind of debates in China. And we might try to do this on an international stage. Shouldn't we start thinking about pooling the resources we have for investment in radical energy innovation internationally, so that we are able to make technological breakthroughs on international stage?
That's actually, that's actually a good question, if I may stop you here, because I was wondering what Graciela thinks as to how does the Paris negotiation should tackle the issue not to end up like Copenhagen. Because, I mean, it's been the 21st conference, and it's year 2015, and it needs to be decided. So what is the way, and please could you kindly comment on the carbon negative energy as mentioned by Wojciech?
Yeah, first of all, I wanted to say it's my privilege to be in this panel and listen to the 2 other panelists, because I never met them before. Wojciech certainly, and Peter, I only met him yesterday. And everything they say is true, and is very wise, and is what needs to happen. And it's a privilege to be in the same panel with them. What I'm going to do, briefly speaking, is to take on from what both of them said, and to even venture the shape that the Manhattan Project could have that Wojciech was talking about. And the pooling of resources for new forms of energy that are what everybody knows is needed. I wanted to explain the reason this links with energy is because 45% of the global emissions, call it half, comes from power plants that produce energy. So the condition that is necessary and sufficient to resolve this issue is to turn our production of energy into clean energy. If we don't do that, 90% of the power plants, 87% of the power plants are fossil fuel. They produce 45% of the global emissions. So unless we change that, there is no solution. And if we change that, there is a solution. So that's why I call it a necessary and sufficient condition. That's why he's talking about energy. It's not his thought, it's a necessity. That's what we're talking about. And by the way, energy is critical for economic development. So when you talk about the wide problem of north-south, the rich and the poor, that's energy again. So I'm going to make a shopping list. And I will discuss a solution, and then I will explain briefly, because we don't have a lot of time, how the solution addresses each of the points of the shopping list. You need a solution for the short run. Less than 1% of the power plants in the planet are the type of renewable energy that needs to be in place in the long run. The power plant infrastructure is $53 trillion worth, just about the same size as the global economy, which is 65 trillion. You ain't going to change that in 15 years, 20 years, or even 30 years. So you need a solution for the short run, and you need a solution for the long run. The only long run solution is to change our production of energy. And it turns out that the only form of producing energy that has the scope of the fossil fuels that we're trying to replace is solar. We can discuss that, anything you want, but in the long run, you need something of that scale to get rid of fossil fuels, and that's solar, which is good news, because the sun has plenty of that, and we have the technology to do that. But it will take a long time, and we are close to the point of no return. By the way, this thing about the point of no return comes from the Phantom of the Opera. Have you guys seen the Phantom of the Opera? There is a part that says, "This is the point of no return." Have you seen it? Right. Okay, that's what I was trying to say. I didn't mean to be light about it, but it's true. So we need a short-term solution that provides more energy for the poor nations, because China has 500 million people that are moving from the countryside to the cities, and they need power plants to give them jobs, economic development. So we need more energy, clean energy, but we can't just go after the power plants. No time for that. We need to do something right now. Short term and long term. Hopefully the short term will not defeat the long term. We need something that addresses the huge income disparity between the poor and the rich, which is unsustainable. We need all nations, including nations like China, who are very poor. There are 100 nations in the world that are richer than China. We need China to accept limits on emissions. Good luck. That has been the problem every year. And not just China, all the developing countries, but we need that. We need a carbon market for which we need carbon limits, because without having limits on carbon emissions, the carbon market, which is a trade of those limits, cannot operate. Look at the shopping list. Look at the problem, how difficult it is. It's much more difficult than the ozone problem, Montreal Protocol. But together with my colleague here to my left, Peter Kalash, we need a solution that is embraced and supported by the business sector. We can't go against the business sector. It doesn't work. That's what happened in the Montreal Protocol. We found a replacement for chlorofluorocarbons that were commercially feasible. And that's why the Montreal Protocol succeeded. Well, we need one of those too, another one. It has to be commercially successful. Look at that. Okay, so I just gave you some idea of the shopping list and why.
If I could stop you there for a second.
So I want to talk about carbon negative technologies and why and how, with the Green Power Fund, they produce a complete solution. But if you stop me there, it looks like I'm giving you more problems and no more solutions.
In a second, first I would like Peter to address this shopping list. If you agree, is this the extensive list, or do you see any other problems?
We mentioned that in Paris there should be 3 complementary outcomes. Agreement, it should be response on the role of technology, and response on financing, which would mobilize the financing, money, which would
I was going to talk about that. Yes.
Which would mobilize the transfer of technology around the world, particularly to the developing countries. Accompanying measures is a program of capacity building, sharing the knowledge, know-how with these countries. And side effect of Paris should be mobilize all players around the, or stakeholders, shareholders, around the planetary dimension, including civil society, including rich and poor countries, and within these countries also areas like business. And I think one of the promising, not fully used, the potential for future solution lies in the business area.
Yes.
And if we now follow what was in contrast to Copenhagen, carefully designed by the French government, the step-by-step preparation business plays in this program and this approach to Paris very important role. 1 month ago, I was invited to participate in so-called Business and Climate Forum in Paris, which was called by French government, opened by President Mr. Hollande, by ministers, and invited 1,500 CEOs from the world corporations to mobilize the interest and support of business towards the Paris Agreement later this year. And we managed to invite to participate not only as observers, Czech Republic, but also we invited the representative of the largest electricity corporation, the Czech Electricity Corporation. They were selected as only one representative of European electricity business. And the round table, similar to this, they declared a very pioneering statement. The energy production by 2050 will be at 0 carbon level, which is a way how the industry should change the attitude towards this, let's say, challenge on the horizon. There is some rational way. Get rid of coal, get more renewable energies. So that's not just the, let's say, blank statement. But we need more business statements like this. And if we come to the very recent climate preparation conference in Bonn, all walls were full of statements of cities, zero carbon by 2030, by 2050, industries, companies. So there is a movement around the world towards what would be part of the shopping list. And I add also the change of behavior, of attitude at all levels. To demonstrate it, what is the challenge in this country? The Czech Republic belongs to the high per capita CO2 emitters. Whereas the European Union would have something like 8 tons per each person living in the European Union a year, 8 tons. In this country is 13, 13. And if we follow this path towards 2050, this country should reduce the per capita consumption from 13 to 2, 6 times down. It's a combination of industry, of transport, but also of domestic sectors. Imagine the change of lives if we do not manage it in a, let's say, productive and, let's say, comfortable way. The people would not give up their comfort. We need to find other ways of behavior. So that's the dimension of this small country. What should happen here in this climate change dimension?
And when you talk about effective ways how to reduce the climate change, now is the time to talk maybe about the carbon negative technology that Graciela wanted to talk about before.
But wait, we need to ask Wojciech of his list, his shopping list. Because we want to make sure that whatever I say satisfies all the shopping lists.
Okay.
We're putting a big
One thing
demand.
One thing I would be extremely careful about is adding items on any shopping list for Paris. It's full enough already. I think that if we are able to proceed towards a reasonable agreement, which does not necessarily mean doing an agreement on carbon commitments, money and subsidies, fossil fuel subsidies in Paris, I would be absolutely satisfied. The question is whether we will be able to do that and how many years the finalization of the agreement will take.
Okay, as I said before, I'm going to repeat that because it's worth it. I mean, the two people on my left are a privilege to be talking with. You have no idea how much ahead of the curve they are with respect to the thinking in this area. I have only one point of disagreement, but it just happens to be enormous, with Peter. But I don't think it's a point of disagreement. It's simply focusing on a point. A, the people in Paris don't know what the hell they are doing. I spoke with the entire negotiating committee. They are very good, very intelligent people, and they say honestly they don't know what they're doing, honestly, and they're right. Secondly, that while everything that Peter said is true, nothing that is being contemplated for Copenhagen, except what I'm going to talk about now, can avert catastrophic climate change. So you can have all the business people that you want, thousands, supporting everybody, and hoping that by the year 2030, 2050, we will have these enormous reductions. The history so far has been, we have these intentions, and every year the quantity of CO2 increases instead of the other way around, globally. Except for the European Union and the countries which are in the carbon market that have been positively declining their emissions very seriously, as it happened in the case of the market for SO2 in the Chicago Board of Trade. Very effective, those markets. Why do I say that nothing that is being done addresses the possibility, which is now very serious, for catastrophic climate change? Because the fifth assessment report of the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, all these thousands of scientists, says that it is too late to reduce emissions and expect that that will avert climate change, catastrophic climate change. Now we need to do something else, according to the IPCC. These are the same IPCC scientists that brought us the problem of climate change in the 90s. Actually, it was known from before, but in the 90s, 96, they said there is, I don't want to quote the words, but there is evidence that human action is having an impact on the climate. Not those words, but something like that. So right now, there is no policy by any business person, by any government, by any scientist, except what I'm going to tell you now, that addresses the issue of how to avert catastrophic climate change, except that the IPCC came up with a fifth assessment report, and they said, black and white, you need carbon negative technologies. So the direction that we need to go was set up by the IPCC, as usual. IPCC has been setting up the direction all the time. They don't have political power, but they say the truth. And they are scientists from all the nations in the world. So I'm going to focus on that. I'm going to focus on what the IPCC says is a necessary condition, which means without it we can't make any progress on averting catastrophic climate change. There exist now carbon negative technologies, but as Peter Kalash said, you need a solution that is not just technological but also political, because it has to be implemented. Technology is not a silver bullet, doesn't run itself. So we're going to discuss a solution that is both financial and technological, that follows the IPCC fifth assessment report. And I will put the package together for your consideration, and then I will go one by one and show how it addresses the shopping list. The package is to take carbon negative technologies which exist, and they are now commercialized. They are right now becoming commercial, and create a segment, a piece of the clean development mechanism, which is money that is allocated from the carbon market that goes to provide incentives for reducing emission in the developing nations. Hold on. The amount of money that you need for this is $200 billion a year. 200 billion. And you will say, good luck. No, not so fast. The carbon market, and it depends when you count, when you observe it, and don't forget that we now have the limits ending in December, so that has had an impact. But the carbon market reached above $300 billion a year of trading. Each one of those dollars, according to the CDM, can be used to pay for projects that reduce carbon emissions. If we transform that, proposal number one, into carbon negative projects instead of projects that reduce emissions, and those two things are different, then that's the first step to satisfy the condition that the IPCC put about needing carbon negative policies. Repeat, there is a clean development mechanism that uses the money from the carbon market to reduce carbon emission. We need it so that it reduces existing carbon in the atmosphere, so it has to be carbon negative projects. What are carbon negative projects? They are technologies that can transform fossil fuel power plants into net sinks of CO2. Are they real? Yes. They are working in Silicon Valley, one of them, and I happen to know because I founded the firm and invented the technology, patented, fundraised $29 million, and the two plants that we built operating now are carbon negative. Meaning what? They are cleaning the CO2 from the power plant of the Stanford Research Institute, and they are taking further CO2 from air, so that the net, the whole operation is carbon negative, and it produces power in a carbon negative way. The way it does that is by using the residual heat from the power plant to power the system instead of using electricity. Very important, because if you use electricity, you are undermining yourself by producing more emissions. So you're trying to clean emissions, and you're producing emissions. But if you use the residual heat, very low heat, 85 degrees centigrade, how low? Less than what you need to boil a cup of tea. No, it's called low. And that cannot produce electricity, so the opportunity cost is very low. That makes very, very cheap. So now you can transform power plants, which are fossil fuels, into net sinks of CO2. And you can use the money from the CDM to pay or to buy offsets. That is the way that power plants are built all over the world. Every single power plant in the universe that we know is built using offsets or purchasing power agreements, PPAs, which means somebody promised, I'll buy so much electricity for 20 years, 8 cents the kilowatt hour, 400 megawatt, whatever, here is a PPA. That's how power plants are built. Against that, the bank gives a loan and the plant is built. We need the CDM to do that, but to do that for carbon negative power plants. Now, where should those plants be? Well, if we make sure that those plants are in developing nations, we help the process of development, because development requires energy. And this is not just clean energy, it's carbon negative energy. So the CDM so far was unable to give enough money to the poorest nations. All the money that the CDM gave mostly went to India and China because they emit so much. So the perversities of the CDM that we created send a lot of money to the largest emitters. This is true, by the way. It's true. So the question was, why? How perverse can that be? That we are sending money to China, and China is increasing emissions, and we're sending more money to China through the CDM. What's going on? Answer. Because we did not know in 1997, when the CDM was created, and the carbon market was created, that we would need carbon negative technologies. At that point, it was okay. 1997, 20 years ago, we could have decreased emissions. But since we didn't do it, this problem became worse, and now it's not a matter of decreasing emissions anymore. It's a matter of taking off the CO2 already in the atmosphere. We need a CDM to have a specialized part that has enough funding coming from the carbon market, so the money is there, so that it can take all the CO2 that we need to take out. How much is that? 37 gigaton every year is what we emit right now, between 30. We need to dedicate money from the carbon market and its CDM to buy power purchase agreements or offsets for carbon negative power plants in the poor nations. That addresses poverty, that decreases the CO2 already in the atmosphere, and if you have $200 billion a year, for which there is enough money in the carbon market, by the way, more than enough, then in 15 years we can take away the 37 gigaton that we are emitting now. Now you will say by 15 years from now we will be emitting more. We'll talk about that. But at least we can clean up the mess that we're making right now. Now, one concern, are we cleaning coal plants? Are we extending the life of fossil fuels as source of energy? The answer is no, because nuclear plants, like the Czech Republic is busy building, and solar plants, concentrated solar power plants, produce plenty of heat to run the system, so that, in fact, the carbon negative technologies I'm talking about operate more efficiently for solar and for nuclear plants, but they also work for fossil fuel plants. So in the short run, they clean the coal, but we should give incentives to move very fast away from fossil fuels and into clean fuels. So this is a transition technology that I'm talking about. Transition means it facilitates and accelerates the transition to clean energy. It doesn't get stuck in the past. Take CO2 from air, is carbon negative like the IPCC fifth assessment report says it should be. There is plenty of money and enough, with that money there is enough CO2 that can be reduced to achieve the purpose in 15 years, which is the limit of the point of no return. By 15 years, we're almost too late. Not quite, but we're almost too late. We need to start doing it now. Now, having said that, there are several other considerations that we made. Where is the financing part? Where is the technology part? I told you about the technology, I'll have to tell you more. The financial part is the Green Power Fund. So in Copenhagen, I proposed a Green Power Fund, which is the $200 billion a year to buy offsets or purchasing power agreements so that the developing nations could build carbon negative power plants. How does that solve the problem I mentioned before? The problem I mentioned before, which was that the developing nations don't emit enough to get CDM money, the poorest nations, is solved simply as follows. Examples. Africa as a continent emits 3% of the global emissions. Latin America as a continent, 5.5%. The 43 small island states, small development island states, SIDS, emit 0.3% of the global emissions. So under the old regime in the Kyoto Protocol, the CDM, they don't have enough reductions to make of their emissions to get any money. The CDM was to reduce emissions. Africa is doing so little in terms of emissions. The small island states are doing so little, and Latin America, that there is not enough reduction for them to get any funding. That's why the perversity that the money from the CDM went to the large developing nations that are large emitters. But watch, if you use carbon negative technologies, a small island state can clean 10 times, 20 times, 50 times more CO2 than what they emit. So the problem about why the CDM didn't go to the poorest nations is resolved. Africa can clean the whole world if they build enough of these carbon negative power plants, if they have enough funding to do that. So that takes care of the CDM perversity that I mentioned before, which is not fair to say that. It's not really fair. It's just what happened. It takes care of that problem.
So we have ways to battle the problem, and I would like now for this panel discussion to transit to another stage, if the panel permits me. We would take a few questions because Ms. Cicciolneschi has been working for early in the morning.
I woke up at 5 today.
And has to take a little rest.
And I taught 4 hours. And one of the students was here. We were in class 4 hours, weren't we?
Okay, so if you have any questions to the panel, please kindly ask. Please.
Hello. Thank you very much for all your contributions. Thank you for slides. I was thinking all the time that climate change and climate protection should be most of all the shared value of all the nations who are coming to the negotiations. And I am thinking, how do you manage that this summit would bring this as a shared value? Okay. Follow the action and perhaps the courage to shift the paradigm. And should the paradigm be green growth, or should we go for more ambitious paradigm shift?
Yes, that is an excellent question. In all fairness, it was mentioned directly by Peter Kalash when he said the most fundamental problem is the problem of values that has to change. And you're saying the same thing. How is it addressed? It is addressed because the values that we're talking about are, if you wish, one way of looking at it is to respond to Oscar Wilde, who once said, an economist is somebody who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. What he meant is our values are out of whack. Our values are all wrong, given by prices. Our values, if you're trying to increase profits, your values, your economic values, are incompatible with the survival of the human species. Simple. This is what you're saying. This is what Peter Kalash is saying. So I'm saying what we need is those crucial basic needs: air, water, food, biodiversity, water, supplies, and the atmosphere, to have a value. Their integrity should have a value. There is other things too. I'm not solving all the problems, okay? Because compassion is not provided here, and compassion is critical. But for those three, we need to have the equivalent of the carbon market, because what the carbon market does is it attaches a value to a clean atmosphere and to a stable climate. So it is possible to change markets by introducing property rights on the global commons that give limits to the nations of the world on how they can use the biodiversity, how they can use the bodies of water, how they can use the atmosphere of the planet, as the carbon market does for the atmosphere, but more generally. And it's not easy. I didn't say it's easy. I said it can be done. I didn't say it's easy. So that all of a sudden, we are satisfying Oscar Wilde in his implicit criticism of the capitalistic society, in which we have a system of economic values that are inconsistent with the survival of the human species, because we have no value for water, no value for clean air, and no value for food. So if we have a value for those three things, we're starting on the right direction. Another value, some level of equality, for God's sakes. We have more than 1 billion people that are below the level of satisfaction of basic needs among the 7 billion, which means that they don't know from day to day if they're going to survive. They don't have enough food or water to survive. Clean water is disappearing as we speak. And by the way, a large majority of these people are women and children. So that we'll be totally clear about that, okay? That's what we're doing to our children and women. So those values that I'm talking about will address that issue, because the money from the carbon market comes from the over-emitters. Who are the over-emitters? So far, the OECD nations, the rich nations. There is also China, but per capita, as you know, China is 25% of the emissions of an American like me. But nevertheless, China will have the right incentives, they have enough resources to deal with this, we hope. But the poorest nation in the small island states, who have done nothing to nobody, and they are going to disappear, 43 island states that are nearly 20% of the vote in the United Nations, the small island states, facing the rising seas, they will have access to technology through the mechanism that I just mentioned, the Green Power Fund, to build new sources of energy to adapt, mitigate, together with the Green Climate Fund, and to forestall climate change, to avoid climate change by extracting CO2 from air and getting paid for that. And the critical point where every year in December we get the COP debates and COP negotiations stall and die is when the developing nations and the industrial nations cannot agree on who should abate, and the developing nations refuse to take limits on emissions. Well, here is another proposal. I didn't tell you because I didn't have the time to tell you everything. Is instead of asking the poor nations to have limits, you can ask a modification of that. Ask the poor nations to have limits up to the point of the decrease in emissions that they can afford, they can produce, and not in emissions, decrease in CO2 from the atmosphere, through the funding they are given by the Green Power Fund to build carbon negative power plants. So if they are funded to build those plants, and those plants decrease the carbon in the atmosphere, they should go ahead and exercise that, and that will be their limit that they commit to, the limit for which they are paid for. They should commit to that. Of course they should. And they will not debate. They will not disagree. So this way you can get agreed limits from the developing nations. And the only problem, and by the way, it is possible to get the developing nations to agree. I have discussed with a number of them, but it remains to be seen in practice, but I have. But the key issue now becomes, what do we do with the United States? My adoptive nation, where I live. It's a wonderful country, wonderful people. So my suggestion for the United States is to give them the rights of a poor developing nation so that they are given the right to limit their emissions up to the point where they are being paid to do that. And in that way, assign the US to be part of the poor nations treatment that we give to the poorest nations in the world, even though it's probably the richest nation in the world, but whatever it takes, let's do it. And this will work.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very thorough answer. Any questions? Oh.
Yeah, just only the simple question.
Your name?
My name is Karel Drago.
What?
Drago. Karel Drago.
Karel Drago.
And just a simple, perhaps it is the stupid question. But I think that this change of the climate, it is nothing new. I think in the story, I read now such a story about Jan Hus. It was the end of the 14th century and the half of the 15th century. And it was the same changing of the climate, but not up, but down. It was the same political problem, economic crisis, the same like you introduced us. So it is the first thing. And the second, I think it's the situation now. I believe your numbers, all numbers. But situation now is that the influence, who has the influence is the big concern, the big companies, not the politics. Politics is nothing. I cannot imagine, because the capitalism is founded on to earn money, to earn more and more and more money. And I cannot imagine that they realize imagine.
I want to answer whenever. I like to answer to that. You are indeed addressing two issues. In the question of the technology we created for global thermostat, the reason we call it global thermostat is because the real serious problem that humankind is facing is the new glacial age. So you're right. But if we can use, and that's what the scientists I'm working with are doing, if we can address the temperature going up or down by using CO2 in the atmosphere to help calibrate it, then we can do now the climate change from the point of view of high temperature. But very soon, we are now on the way to a glacial age. We have to do something about that. Okay, number one. Number two, you say, and you're right, Mr. Drago?
Yes.
You say, and you're right, you cannot believe that human nature would allow anything except making more money, making more money, making more money. I just wanted to explain that if you have the right market structure, markets for biodiversity, markets for water, clean water, markets for a clean atmosphere, then you make money by cleaning the atmosphere. You make money by conserving water. You make money by conserving biodiversity. So your objective, and that's the point that Oscar Wilde made, your objective is becoming more aligned with the real objective, which should be the survival of the species. I'm sure we don't disagree that we should be all trying to preserve the survival of the species. Anyway, this is not a complete answer, but I had to stop here.
And I pray
that you are right.
I also like to give the floor to Petr Kalaš.
You touched a very important and I think challenging question. Behavior of business in the context of challenges we are observing. Even if we admit that the prevailing part of business would behave as you mentioned, so short-term, business-oriented, there's a growing awareness among the largest corporations around the world that the business can prosper only in the prospering society, in the prospering country, in prospering planet. And so the opening the perspective to longer-term behavior in the minds of the CEOs of these big companies created, let's say, some adjustment. There is a World Business Council for Sustainable Development organization with 200 largest corporations around the world, and they subscribe the changing attitude to recognize that the services for better biodiversity, better other services, environment, and so would create some business opportunity. And we are now discussing the transition period to expand this vision, these principles around the world business. We created a similar organization in the Czech Republic. I'm vice president. We have 30 companies who already gradually accept this behavior. It's a difficult long-term process here because the profit-oriented minds and interest prevails. But there is a shift, and we hope that the values which will provide or be assigned to growth should not be just the money, growth in money. It should be also social capital, environmental capital, so it would be the sustainable growth of the society. The discussion started at the highest level, UN, etc. For mankind, it takes time to change the attitude, the values, and hopefully in the time of this generation, we can shift this behavior to the positive way.
Mr. Kotecki would like to add something.
Yep. 10 years ago, I would say, well, we need right market incentives so that it makes sense for businesses to invest in clean energy like renewables, nuclear, and energy efficiency. And it continues to be the case. However, one of the most interesting developments in climate-wise in global business in recent years is a rising perception of businesses that even if there is not sufficient policy yet, the policy, some sort of policy, will come sooner or later. And some of the more progressive businesses are already starting to invest in clean technologies ahead of policy because they sort of understand that being first mover may be an interesting business strategy in the longer term. And that's very interesting new development. Clean investment of businesses ahead of policy, even though the policy will have to come, and that's something we have to do as the society.
I think it has to be pointed out how right these gentlemen are. Last week, the 6 largest gas and oil companies, including British Petroleum, including Total, including Shell, and 3 more, made a petition to the United Nations to strongly advocate a price on carbon that was uniform over the whole world in an open letter. Just imagine that.
Mr. Kalaš?
To show the big change that has taken place.
When we are talking about business, I think another area should deserve our attention, which is the role of the government. And I'm quite pleased with the shift of behavior in this country in last 2 years. And it happened that under the Prime Minister office, the Governmental Council for Sustainable Development, for principles of this balanced way of development of this country was created or recreated. And there are committees which are working on issues like energy, like transportation, like others, to bring this country's perspective in the longer term and find out policies and recommendations to the government which goes beyond the interest of parties here, and we can use the coal and we can other parties. So there is a kind of rectification of the processes here, and we only hope that this trend in the Czech Republic will continue in the way under this or other governments, because we are concentrated on the value for the state and not for the individual stakeholders.
And the one last question, please.
Hello, my name is Veronica.
Loud.
Veronica.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Veronika Portysheva, and I would like to ask, since we are talking about the negative carbon technologies, could you mention some disadvantages that we should be aware of? Is it?
I'm sorry, I missed the question.
Some disadvantages, if there are any disadvantages to the carbon negative technologies.
The technologies I'm talking about are very mild. They don't have disadvantages in the sense that they don't produce emissions, negative emissions. They are profitable, so they are favorable to the business interest. And the only disadvantage I see is that they require a lot of building of plants which are essentially carbon capture plants from air, taking the carbon from air, not carbon from other sources. You can put one of these plants here in this classroom, or you can put it out there without needing to have a concentrated source of carbon, because it takes it directly from air. And that's what the IPCC says is needed. So you need to build a lot of them. How many? Thousands. And the only good thing is that they are very relatively low cost, and they can come from the carbon market. So the critical thing is to get that carbon market, like the oil and gas companies have recommended, to have a price on carbon that aligns the values of a clean atmosphere with commercial profits. So this is Adam Smith again. But it's Adam Smith that is wearing a different dress, because this is not Adam Smith to rape the atmosphere. But if you have a carbon market, Adam Smith is making profit from cleaning the atmosphere. This has to be understood as a change in values, using the market as a change in value. And once you change the markets like that, you change capitalism forever. This is the transformation of capitalism. And it's happening right now. I wish I could talk more, but I'm so tired, I can't even see straight. I want to go sleep.
Thank you very much. I think that was an amazing end to the discussion, that capitalism evidently needs to change. I would like to thank the panelists tonight, Petr Jan Kalaš, Vojtěch Patecký,
Thank you.
and Graciela Cicilnisky.